What is it that makes Russians embrace the war in Ukraine? Ian Garner is an assistant professor at the Pilecki Institute in Warsaw, Poland. He's a fellow at the Center for International and Defense Policy, and he's the author of the book Z Generation, Into the Heart of Russia's Fascist Youth. Professor Garner joins the podcast today to discuss the issue of Russian propaganda, Russian youth culture, and how Vladimir Putin has used the state to effectively quash any competing storylines. We talk about the stories that Russian media tells ordinary Russians about their own country, the national mythos they are trying to construct, and ultimately why Russia's youth and their youngest generations have wholeheartedly embraced the invasion of Ukraine and a larger war against the West. As always, thank you for listening to the podcast. Thank you for recommending the podcast to friends, sharing it on social media. All of that is greatly appreciated. And if you want to support the work that we do at the Center for New Liberalism, the best way to do that is by becoming a member. You can join your local chapter. You can join our insider discussions. You can get swag, bonus episodes of the podcast, and much more. Join today at cnliberalism.org. Thanks for listening and enjoy the episode. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and joining me today is Ian Garner. Ian, welcome to the show.
Hi, Jeremiah. Thanks for having me.
So, you wrote a book that really captured my attention, and I'm a few years late on this, but I was really interested when I picked this up, and the book was kind of a terrifying read in some ways. It's called Z Generation, and it's about basically youth in Russia, but more than the youth themselves. I would say it's a book about the systems and the practices that Russia uses to control their information environment, their media environment, the propaganda. And so I want to start there with kind of just level setting, I guess, what is the current state of things before we kind of try to get into explaining, how did it happen and why did it happen? Let's just talk about what is the facts on the ground, I guess. What is the information environment like in Russia right now? If you are a normal Russian citizen, what is your media diet like? And I'm guessing your answer is going to be it's pretty bad. And I want to talk about where we are and how it got to be that bad.
Yes, you anticipate my answer, but the word I would use is chaotic. The media environment is just this complete tangle of information and ideas that the state wants you to experience. The Russian state wants you to be confused. It wants you to feel like there's too much to deal with, so that you go running towards the simple explanations of the simple narratives about the world that the state puts forward. And it does that, we all know about the TV propagandists and the absurd stuff you read in the newspapers, but it's really social media and the digital world where that is happening, because Russia is a digital country. Russians are just as online as North Americans and Europeans. They are living their worlds through social media. They're getting the news online, not all the same social media that we use, which is an important point. But the state has learned very effectively, especially over the last 5 or 6 years, I don't want to say the state is able to control people, because I don't think the Russian state is that clever, but they are certainly able to bewilder people and then offer them something really simple.
It almost reminds me of a line from Mad Men, where, Don Draper's an advertising executive in this TV show, and he says that, the key to advertising is to create an itch, that there's something that's missing, and then you slide in your product as like the lotion that soothes that itch. And it kind of reminds me of that, if the goal is just to create a really chaotic media environment that nobody can trust anything, then you just slide in, well, here's a simple story from the state that you can trust. And you slide that in as an antidote to the chaos.
It's funny that you mention advertising, actually, and you probably did this in an offhand way, and it's a good comparison. But the Russian state started on this journey under Putin pretty much at the turn of the millennium, when Putin became president, which, let's remember, was on the very last day of 1999. So it's very symbolic. And he's been accompanied almost all of this time, up until very recently, by a guy called Vladislav Surkov, who is sometimes known as his Grey Cardinal. And Surkov is a really weird and interesting figure. He's totally on board with the whole Putinist project, but he's also very fascinated by Western culture, and especially this sort of consumerist branding PR culture that we have in the West. And he was back in even the year 2000, 2001, experimenting with television, with big sort of branded rallies, those sort of flag-waving, Putin t-shirt wearing pictures that you might remember if you were around 20, 25 years ago of young people in particular in Putin, as a way of somehow imbuing Putin with the idea of this sort of mass support from youth. And he experimented with those ideas and continued to bring them in line with Western practices over the past couple of decades for very long and boring reasons to do with struggles in the Kremlin. It's a bit inside baseball. Surkov is no longer so closely associated with Putin. But, it's very strange, and I'm sure we'll get into this, that Russia is politically vehemently opposed to the West and defines itself as the anti-Western nation, almost to the point where it doesn't have anything to say about itself except we're not that, whatever the West is. And yet at the same time, they are hoovering down Western culture. They're hoovering down Western propaganda, Western advertising methods. And indeed, and here's where I'll stop, Surkov's favorite singer of all time is Tupac Shakur.
That is unexpected. But I want to dive a little bit deeper into the media-specific spaces, because like you said, there's propaganda that goes on all the time in Russia. The state controls the media very tightly. How did it get to the point where it is now, where whether it's on social media or traditional media, television, radio, etc., movies, pretty much everything is controlled by the state. And unless you're in some kind of encrypted, anonymized space, you really don't speak out against the state at all. How did it get to that point? Because I've talked with journalists from Russia who said, that 10 years ago, in 2014 or 2015, or maybe go back to before the invasion of Crimea, maybe go back to 2012 or 2013, but this was still during, the Putin reign, but that it wasn't that bad in 2012, that you felt like, you had to be careful, but you could still say what you wanted to say. You could still expose corruption. You could still do certain things. And that over the last 10 years or so, it's gotten much, much, much worse. And how did that happen? Did things used to be better? Is my impression of that correct? And if so, what was the tipping point for, that the media has just completely ceased to be an independent power in Russian society?
The signs were always there under Putin. And I think it's important not to look back to the 2000s and see it as this, nostalgic age where Russians had some sort of, real freedom of speech, because in many ways they didn't. Because Putin came of age as a political actor in the 1990s, and he saw how important it was to control the media when Boris Yeltsin, his predecessor as president, just got absolutely battered through the mid-90s and into the late 90s by an independent media. And pretty much as soon as he came to power, he started clamping down on the media in some way or another. taking control of television stations, finding corruption, whether real or imagined, and finding cases of embezzlement and bribery and other law-breaking activities amongst the oligarchs who owned the television stations, the radio stations, the newspapers, you name it. Of course, it was all analog media back then. And of course, in the 2000s, there was real violence as well. Journalists who criticized the government did not have it easy. They were not able to say everything they wanted. They had to self-censor to some extent. And of course, the most famous case is the case of Anna Politkovskaya, who was a liberal, a journalist who covered Putin's second Chechen war in the 2000s. And she was shot in Moscow because she exposed corruption and bribery. She exposed the rape and the violence that was going on at the front. And the deal in the 2000s was this for most Russians. And this is something I really begin to dig into in the book, which is about the experiences of ordinary people. And I talk to a lot of ordinary Russians, and their stories are in the book. The 2000s were this, that you can pretty much do what you want, be who you want to be, go out, be gay, be liberal, be Europeanized, but don't push into politics too hard, right? Let Putin take charge. It's a very patriarchal political culture that was becoming embedded in Russia. Let him do what he needs to do, and you'll all get rich. You'll all have the opportunities to live the way you wanted. That changed in 2012, when a number of things happened, or had happened. First, mass protest movements based around Ilya Yashin, Alexei Navalny, Boris Nemtsov, all these opposition leaders, and tens of thousands of Russians protested, principally having organized themselves using the internet. There was the Arab Spring, which scared the living bejesus out of Putin because he saw, again, the power of digital media to allow people to self-organize. And then, and I think this is actually probably the biggest turning point, there was the global financial crisis and the end of the resources boom. Because Russia got rich in the 2000s, not off of Putin's brilliant economic leadership, but off of rising resource prices. And as soon as they started falling, the good times started slowing down, and Putin had to find a different path. And the different path was a turn to extreme nationalism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I said, I've talked with a couple people who've worked in Russian media, and the sense I get is that they were careful back then, but that there were things you could do. You know, one of the things I think they did frequently was it's not Putin, it's these corrupt local functionaries. It's the what do you call it? The good Tsar, bad boyars kind of thing. You know, you blame the local guy, and then the surely Putin will save us from these corrupt local officials, but that kind of thing was still very much permissible, and that they didn't consider it all that out of the ordinary, and that things turned really, I guess, around that time.
Yeah, certainly in the 2000s. You know, if you were a journalist, you would know if you were going to be targeted. You knew if you were doing the investigative reporting like Politkovskaya was doing that would cause real trouble. You would get warnings. You didn't just go to jail. You weren't just willy-nilly shot. Not that it makes shooting journalists right, but you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, there was an escalation period. And I think the role of the internet here is interesting because you talk about how obviously the internet played a role in the Russian government deciding to clamp down more. They were scared of the Arab Spring. They were scared of protest movements, color movements, as they call them. And what's interesting is that now they've turned what they used to be afraid of, it seems, into a strength. And they have a very different digital media ecosystem there. They don't have the same Facebook and Google and everything else. They typically use different sites, like Russia-specific sites. Can you tell me a little bit about what the average Russian is experiencing on VKontakte or on Telegram? How are they getting their news online, and how does the Russian government, how did they learn to kind of control what happens on social media rather than being afraid of it?
I think before I talk about that, I do want to point out that as well as these what are called Runet sites, that are sort of parallel social media sites, and indeed a whole almost parallel internet that functions in the Russian speaking world, which of course extends beyond the borders of Russia, because there are many Russian speakers who are exposed to this information environment, in Kazakhstan, across Central Asia, and across Eastern Europe. The many, especially young Russians, are not just on the Runet, they're also using Instagram, although it is nominally banned in Russia. The ban is very easy to get around. And they're using TikTok, which is run by a friendly country, effectively, China. And so the information environment isn't as controlled as you might imagine in an authoritarian or a totalitarian country. There is a lot of chaos in this, and the state seems quite happy with allowing chaos. And so Telegram is a good example of how that kind of chaos can work. Because Telegram purports to be completely independent, right? It's this very sort of freewheeling environment. Anyone can make a channel. There's a high degree of, or at least seemingly a high degree of anonymity. There are big channels that you can follow. And you can get and do almost anything you want. So what does the state do to control that environment? Well, the answer is, it seems there is some degree of complicity between Telegram and the Russian state. I don't want to comment any further because Pavel Durov, the owner of Telegram, is very rich and very litigious. So I'll just leave you to imagine what that might look like. But of course, I don't think ordinary Russians are really thinking about that very much.
Yeah, it's funny. There was there was a big episode recently where this is something I covered from a technology angle, where people were comparing Telegram and Signal, and a lot of people were saying like, "Oh, Signal can't be trusted because of blah 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 reasons. It's not really secure," and those reasons were typically bad, and they were promoting Telegram as an alternative when Telegram is, in reality, much less secure than Signal. It's much harder to make yourself actually, end-to-end encrypted on Telegram. It's much easier to mess that up. And it was interesting kind of tracing back some of the people who were making anti-Signal arguments and realizing they had ties to kind of the international right, the Putin sympathetic right internationally. And is that a coincidence? Maybe, but I don't think so.
Yeah, let's stick with maybe. But let's then look at how the Russian state might target young people online in particular. So there is this youth group in Russia called the Youth Army, Yunarmia. It is a paramilitary youth group. They're like Cub Scouts with guns. It's like cadets, but more violent, basically. The kids who join up, this is a state organization. It's existed for a decade or so. The kids who join up, they do military marches, military parades, they take history lessons because history is a big part of the state's politics about, it is all pretty much military history, really, and especially World War II history. They do live firing exercises, they go to summer camps, which look very much like Soviet summer camps. This is explicitly designed to prepare soldiers for the army. You can literally look on their website and it says that's what we're trying to do. So there is no hidden desire here. But as kids, well, why would I get involved in this? The leader of the youth army is this guy Nikita Nagorny, who is an Olympic gymnast. He's in his 20s, late 20s now. He's a handsome boy. He's an Instagram, VK, and Telegram influencer in his own right. He has hundreds and hundreds of thousands of followers, and he does pretty sort of typical fitness influencer stuff. Picture any of those influencers on Instagram who are working out, posting their, here's what I ate, here's the cool celebrities I met today, here's my wife and I going for some fancy dinner in a nice restaurant in Moscow, whatever. It's a desirable life. It's fun, right? Now, Nagorny is posting on his Telegram feed, here's all the stuff that I'm doing day to day. This is fun, this is engaging. In and amongst this, when you actually read the messages very carefully, you will find messages that are designed to echo the state's lessons about patriotism, the state's lessons about the past, the state's lessons about nationalism, and the state's lessons about militarism, right? So very quietly, somebody like Nagorny could promote the messages of the state in a space that looks like it's just a kind of a fun influencer space where kids can share these messages, they can comment on the messages, They can like them. They can post them to their friends. Nagorny can sometimes reply back to them how wonderful this celebrity influencer is engaging with me. It's just all good, clean, honest fun, right? But the state can disperse its messages.
So essentially, it's like if the Kardashians or, our version of big mega influencers were all kind of co-opted by the state. My sense reading your book was that over the course of the last 10 years, anybody who's got a substantial following on social media either has to be extremely apolitical in every single way, or they have to parrot the talking points. And that if there is someone who's not doing one of those two things, that the state will pretty quickly intervene. You're not permitted to be a social media star independent of the state, so to speak.
Absolutely. And I think in terms of that aspect of trying to be apolitical, it often leads to some quite banal material. If you look at the most popular influencers in Russia, unsurprisingly, a lot of it is video game streaming. Video games are very popular in Russia, but then you look at what video games are they playing and how they actually talk within those video game spaces. And well, they're playing World of Tanks. Is that the name? I believe so. I'd have to double check. But this is a Belarusian-made game. They're playing Call of Duty. And when they're talking, and when the people that are talking around them are talking, they are not spreading, pro-LGBT, pro-Ukrainian arguments. They're saying, we love war. This is good fun. Let's go out and kill. They're using slang and they're using language drawn from the culture around them. So this just slowly, bit by bit, normalizes the state's messages, even within environments that actually look highly apolitical.
And what are those messages? Obviously, there's the basic message of they've started this war in Ukraine and this is a good war, this is a holy war, or, this is, a war to save the Russian people, etc. But on a larger level, what are the narratives that they want society to accept? If they're kind of pushing a narrative of why Putin is legitimate and why the war in Ukraine is good, and they're telling a larger story about Russia and the Russian people, what is this story that they're trying to tell?
So we have to zoom way out from thinking about Telegram groups and influencers and start talking about some, frankly, weird metaphysical shit. And it's stuff that won't make much sense if you are not...
I love that. Let's get as weird as possible.
If you are not one of the faithful, this is going to sound really bizarre. But the grand narrative that underlies the Putinist state is that Russia has to be resurrected by sacrificing itself in war. And that this has been the historical fate of Russia forever, as it will be forever. War is just the inevitable state of the world. And I'll give you the historical background is that Russia was invaded 800 years ago, or whatever it was, by the Mongols. Russia was almost destroyed. Russia just about held on to itself, but as a result of finally beating the Mongols, the Muscovy, as it then was able to flourish and take control of most of the expanse of the Slavic lands. Then in 1453, Constantinople, the seat of Orthodox Christianity, falls to the Muslims. Russia is now the only Orthodox power in the world that is tasked with defending Christianity and civilization, because those terrible Catholics over in Rome are awful heathens, and they're just as bad as the Muslims. Then in 1812, Napoleon invades from the west, almost burns down Moscow, almost destroys the country, but then Russia somehow rises from the ashes, and they use this phoenix-like motif of rising from the ashes very frequently in the political culture. And the Russians go charging across Europe, having defeated Napoleon and saved the entirety of Europe. Then we get to World War II, and this is the crowning historical moment in this religion of war, in which the world is essentially arraigned against Russia. Yes, the fascists are invading, the Germans are invading, but Churchill and Roosevelt won't open a second front in Europe. They leave Russia to die. Russia at Stalingrad in particular in 1942 almost dies. 1 million people die. And when you look at the materials, and I wrote a book about Stalingrad a few years back, Stalingrad itself dies and then is resurrected. And the whole of humanity, the whole of civilization, the whole of time itself is saved because of this sacrifice. And you'll notice that this is a sort of strange distortion of the Christian story of Jesus, who isn't regrettably sacrificed, avoidably sacrificed, but has to die. And this is the big difference between the way that Russians think about war, or at least the faithful Russians think about war, and the way that we in the West might think about war, and in particular the Second World War, where we say, well, we respect the sacrifices of the fallen, but we wish it didn't have to happen. And we would have hoped to have found a way in which it didn't have to happen. No, Putin in particular has been stoking this fire for 25 years. They had to die. And thus today we have to endure terrible suffering in order that we might flourish anew. And indeed, what was he saying in the year 2000 when he came to power? Yes, the 1990s were terrible. We got our asses handed to us in Chechnya. The economy almost collapsed in 1998, but thank God for those sacrifices, because it means only now, under my wise leadership, can we flourish anew.
There's a real kind of set of contradictions here that are probably just embraced, like you said, where, you know, if times are good, it's because we sacrificed before. If times are bad, it's because sacrifice is necessary. And I know that there's an almost holy level of reverence for the World War II generation, and that is the kind of like in America, but taken to an even stronger degree, that is the defining generation of Russians, that we owe them everything and we should replicate what they've done if we can. You know, we should joyfully sacrifice ourselves. And I don't know, to me, there's a lot of contradiction there. And also just in how they see Europe, which is, you know, they define themselves against Europe. You know, we are Russian. We're not like the cowardly and degenerate Europeans and things like that. But also, it strikes me that there's a very love-hate thing with Europe. That they don't hate the Europeans the way they would hate like barbarians or like the Mongol hordes. Like they're very much, they have a superiority complex and an inferiority complex towards Europeans at the same time.
I mean, this is a debate that's been going on for 200 years in Russia and counting, between what are called Slavophiles, and that is Russians who think that Russia, we better serve steering clear of European ideas, that there is something in the Russian soil, in the Russian soul, that's very sort of native soil conservatism, and Westernizers who think, no, we need to look to the West. And there's been some great philosophy that's very profound coming out of this, but much of it, especially today, is not very thoughtful, is not very reflective, and is highly contradictory. And we've already pointed out, you know, the state, as much as it's spreading these messages that Russia is surrounded by enemies and it's on the brink of destruction, it has to wage war to save itself, it is also basing its entire culture in Western pop culture. And if you spend even a few minutes watching the sort of insane Russian pop music, patriotic stuff that the government is trying to make popular, and not very effectively because most of it's absolutely unlistenable, it's just Europop. It's the same stuff. There's nothing new in it. There's nothing clever, and there is indeed not much uniquely Russian about it.
This is something I actually talk about sometimes with Asia commentators and China watchers, which is that, you know, authoritarian regimes are really bad at pop culture. And it says something that, you know, like Korea gave us K-pop and a worldwide phenomenon, and Japan gave us manga and anime and all these, you know, really fantastic movies and things like that. And like, what culture have we gotten from China, which is a country that is an order of magnitude bigger than both of those? Yeah, pretty much nothing in terms of music, TV shows. Like there's nothing there. And it strikes me that something similar is happening with Russia, that just the authoritarian nature of the government does not permit good creative culture to flourish. That there's something inherent in the nature of authoritarianism that just prevents that.
No, and certainly. Since 1917, Russia hasn't produced much very interesting culture except dissident and opposition culture. And it's produced some great dissident and opposition culture. Some people would say that Russians have contributed nothing to world culture, and especially under the Soviet Union, but I don't think that's true.
We're not taking anything away from Solzhenitsyn here or anything, but...
Well, so, great author, but weird guy when it comes to the politics, especially his latter-day politics, which is fueled some of the national sort of
fair
irredentist movement in Russia. But there were some great dissident artists in the Soviet Union, and I think there have been some great dissident artists working in Russia over the last 20 years. But the official culture has produced very little of any interest, and I'm somebody who spent a lot of time trying to empathize with cultural producers who work for the state and trying to understand what makes them tick. But most of it's just unreadable, unwatchable, and unlistenable.
Let's talk about empathy. That's actually a great segue to where I wanted to go next. We've been talking about kind of the methods and the media and social media and the culture and how all of this is controlled by the state. But what we haven't done much of yet is talk about what the people themselves believe. And I almost always try to empathize with regular people. Whenever there's a conflict going on, independent of, I think this state has the correct, is correct and they're morally justified in what they're doing, and this other state is taking unjustified actions and I hope they're defeated. Independent of all that, I almost always try to empathize with the regular people. Regular people on the ground do not deserve to be impoverished or to die in war or to have their homes blown up or their family members killed. And so I always try to keep that in mind. But it was a difficult read, kind of absorbing some of this stuff in your book, because I went into this thinking, well, regular Russians, they don't support all this killing and genocide and all the terrible things that are happening in Ukraine, the kidnapping of all these children, and like regular Russians are just trying to get by. They're just trying to pay their bills and put food on the table. And your book was kind of like, I don't know if I'm misquoting you here, but it was kind of say, well, no, there's a lot of regular Russians, just normal everyday Russians who are really gung-ho about this. And, I don't think you would claim all of them feel that way, but a lot of them, it certainly this seems like are just all in. They think this is necessary and should be done, and especially in the young generation. So I guess the question I would have here is, to what extent do the Russian people just fully buy into this? Like they've accepted the narrative. They think the war in Ukraine is a just and necessary and holy war to save Russia, and they will support it as long as they need to. How do they actually feel about this, the regular Russian person?
I think one of the most important things I would highlight out of my book, which is, as I say, based around stories and talking to ordinary people, is that there is almost no such thing as a regular Russian, right? Especially in the social media age where we're able to construct very individualized and very fragmented realities for ourselves by choosing to subscribe to certain channels, by getting lost in a TikTok algorithm, right? Where you're the only person seeing this particular combination of things based on probably mostly quite subconscious actions you take as you watch a video for a couple of seconds longer as you happen to like something, right? But here's what we can say. That sociologists, and I think some of the people who are more skeptical about Russian support for the war, point to opinion polls that suggest, well, 15 to 20% of the Russian population are really all on board with the extreme version. And don't worry, because it's only 15 to 20%. To which my response is, well, hold on. 15 to 20% being on board with, you can call it a genocide in Ukraine or not, though this is not the space to have that conversation necessarily, but being on board with mass murder, with violence, with the embrace of this apocalyptic language, this language of desirable war. In a country of 130 million people, you're talking 20 million people? That's a lot of people.
Well, and if 15 to 20% are on board with it, then the great silent majority are probably just going to go along. If 15 to 20% are...
that is the key.
If they're going to be as loud as possible, and they're going to get the money and support, and they're going to get the positions within the government and the media, and that's all you need. It'd be one thing if it was 1 to 2%
exactly
trying to prop this up against 95% of the population who doesn't like it. But with 20% in an authoritarian state, you can do almost anything. Think about how many authoritarian states throughout the world are actually like ethnic minorities within their own state, but they've got 10 to 15%, and that's enough to keep power.
So right now, there are about 4 to 5 million people in Russia involved in the security apparatus in some way. So this is a lot, but it's not huge. And Russia is easily able to bring people into its army, not just because of the money they're offering to soldiers, but also because of the respect they offer to soldiers. And then the opportunities that money gives them to advance in society, right? To get good things, to buy good stuff, the kind of stuff that, by the way, hasn't really been available to ordinary Russians for a decade now. So war is quite an opportunity for people. And the point that I really want people to get out of the book is that the state, they understand that not every young Russian is going to turn into a, goose-stepping fascist machine who will participate in violence. And that even those who do may not believe a single word of the ideology and this crazy shit, but it doesn't really matter. Because all you need are a few people who believe it or not will go and point their gun at a Ukrainian and pull the trigger. And it doesn't matter what they believe ultimately when they pull that trigger. For the state's purposes, they've pulled the trigger. That's good enough.
What about Putin personally? How authentically popular is he? Because obviously we can talk about the war, and it's hard to say, obviously. It's not like independent polling that is super high quality is really allowed in Russia, but it seems correct to say broadly that there's some Russians who full out support the war, that 15 to 20%. There's probably some who don't think it's a good idea, but they're smart enough to stay silent. And then kind of the mass of people who just are going to follow the incentives, like you said, whether it's the money, the opportunity. But with regards to Putin personally, I know that there's kind of this sense that Putin is the one who pulled us back from the chaotic 1990s, and that for a long time, even though he was a dictator, he was very authentically popular because of that perception that he pulled Russia out of its chaotic days. Is that still the case? Is it still the case that, Putin actually has the respect of most people, that Putin has the majority of the population supporting him? Has that changed at all? Are we even able to tell?
I mean, it is extremely hard to tell. Again, it's extremely hard to tell genuine belief, but from the way that people actually behave, they appear to support him. And there is this greatly important effect of giving the appearance that everybody supports him. That's what really matters to him. Because then you start to break down the chances of actually developing any kind of coherent opposition, because it looks like if you are, as some of the people that I interview in the book told me, it looks like if you're an anti-Putin activist or somebody who is not yet an activist but wants to oppose Putin, it looks like you're the only one. You're isolated in that social media space because you're bombarded with commentary and materials, whether it's real or not, whether it's trolls, bots, who knows, that says that no, Putin's the only option. So there are these endless debates about, well, what if there were free elections in Russia? Wouldn't Putin be less popular? And of course, he would be less popular if there were free elections. Any democratic leader is less popular than 119% of the vote, or whatever Putin got at some of the polling stations in the last election. But that doesn't really matter to me, in a sense, because all we have to do is deal with the situation as it stands now, and that situation is that, yes, most Russians seem to genuinely, whether begrudgingly or not, have some sort of respect or display some sort of respect for Putin.
What about the younger generation specifically? Your book has a clever title in that, it's a play off Gen Z, which is what we say in America. Maybe other countries do that too. I don't know if that's international or not. But, reversed into the Z generation, where Z is kind of the symbol of Russian victory. It's the symbol of support for the war and support for the government. And in naming the book that, you're kind of staking a claim that, like, Russia's younger generation has genuine enthusiasm for what is essentially fascism, what is essentially authoritarian, right-wing, nationalist government control of both media and industry and all of society, that this is something that Russia's youth are learning to support. What do we know about how the youth compare to other generations?
First, a shameless plug for myself, because on that topic of is Russia fascist or not, I have another book coming out on August the 4th or 5th called Russia and Modern Fascism. So you should have a read of it. It's going to be, if you think this one was miserable, the new one is truly depressing.
We'd love to have a bad time.
Well, you'll always get one when you read my work. Look, we know that young people are participating in the state's projects, to some extent because they're forced to. Because if you go to a public educational institution in Russia today, a school, a college, a university, you have to take mandatory patriotism lessons. You have to take part in Victory Day concerts and meetings. You have to behave in a certain way. It's very old-fashioned Soviet stuff in that regard. But these new movements as well, like the Youth Army, there is another one, the so-called Movement of the First, Движение Первых, that has existed for now 2 years, maybe 2.5 years, that is meant to be a youth army, but a little softer around the edges, a little more palatable. They make themselves look fun. And we know that kids are volunteering to go and join. And we know there are, I believe, about 2 million people in the youth army. And the state's claim I find a bit dubious, but 5 to 6 million in the movement of the first. And those young people will go on, unless something changes in Russia, to occupy positions in the civil service. They'll be the ones who'll be permitted to enter and study at the best universities. They will be the people controlling the government and controlling the security forces. And they will be very keen, especially as modern surveillance technology increases, to exert further control over the digital world and to shape people's opinions that way and to keep potential opposition either silent or to push them out of Russia entirely, or worse. And I'm not saying I see any signs right now of any, plans for Stalinist purges. I think that's just a step too far. But, the state is moving in an increasingly draconian direction, and young people don't seem to be opposed to it.
Well, and that the Stalinist purges idea, you know better than I do. I'm just a guy over here who doesn't know the subject matter all that well. But it doesn't seem that far-fetched to me, because, you can, I guess you can look at this one of two ways. Are the youths true believers in this kind of apocalyptic vision of Russian society that must continually sacrifice itself for the good of the world and the good of the Russian people, that the world is arrayed against Russia, and we must, fight these people who are trying to steal our Russianness and kill, it's why the Russian-speaking populations in all these other countries always end up being such a symbol. There's the people who actually believe that. And then there's the people who kind of cynically just want to get along and advance themselves. And that happens in a lot of different autocracies. You could argue that in China, the CCP, most CCP mid-level functionaries are not ideological in the same way we're talking about in terms of believing some apocalyptic vision about China, but they know how to get along. They know how to work connections, and they know that this, the party is the only way to advance your career, and they're ambitious. And so we can think about those two things, right? Are you just cynically getting along, advancing yourself? Are you an actual true believer? And doesn't matter what the difference is. But when I think about like Stalinist purges, if you study China, a lot of modern day like Xi Jinping thought is that like the USSR only fell because they went away from Stalinism, that was their big mistake, was that they went away from purges and Stalinism and they tried to be softer, and we're never going to make that mistake again. And so you can see, Xi in kind of a lighter way, not millions dead, but he's continually purging the party of anybody who might be a threat to him, anybody who might have an independent power base. And that to me seems likely in Russia as well, that, whether it's Putin or whether it's a successor, there will never be, never is a strong word, but that independent power bases basically will be anathema for the foreseeable future.
I think you're right. And probably the luckiest thing to have happened to Putin since the start of the war is when those several 100,000 Gen Z and millennial middle-class people, mostly from Moscow and St. Petersburg, left in the first few months of the war, and they went out to Kazakhstan, and Georgia, Armenia. Some of them went to Eastern Europe, wherever they could, but they got out of Russia.
Because those would be his strongest opposition. Those would be the people most...
That's the opposition. You don't need to do a purge if they all just leave, right? And good for them, and I understand why they didn't stay and battle, because it would have been an extremely hard battle and it would have been extremely dangerous for them. But the opposition's kind of gone. There is no opposition leader in Russia, and there is no opposition movement. And so will there be in 5-10 years some sort of Stalinist purge in Russia? Well, it's impossible to say. I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's likely.
Well, and when I think about those purges, what I'm saying is more like, it's not that, it's not the case that Stalin was like purging millions of people who were committed liberal Democrats in the USSR. He was purging other people who were Soviet socialists, but just who had independent power bases, or who posed some sort of a threat to him, or real or imagined or whatever. That, in Russia, it could be the case that, oh, well, this influencer gets too popular and starts to have ideas of his own, and so he gets purged, even though he's been a strong supporter.
Well, I mean, we see that already, because people keep falling out of windows in Russia, right? So we are seeing this to some extent. The people that won't leave are silenced in some fashion or another. But I don't think it's Putin's style to do a Stalinist purge, and I'll tell you why. The Stalinist purge was not as controlled as many people think. It was certainly ordered and orchestrated directly from the top. I'm not saying that Stalin didn't bear responsibility for it, and the Communist Party didn't bear responsibility for it. Of course they did. But it wasn't really designed to root out the opposition or enemies of socialism. It was designed purely to enact violence at home. And it became highly chaotic. And that sort of chaos is not something that Putin really goes in for. He likes to have things very much under control. He likes different power blocks in society to give a public performance of battling it out between themselves. And the Prigozhin quasi-revolution, or whatever it was a couple of years back, is a good example. But ultimately, he likes somebody else to kind of do the fighting, come out the winner, while he's at the top pulling the strings. It's a bit more sort of mafia boss-like in that regard.
That makes sense. And, there's one question I want to end on, because we're coming up on time soon, but before we head out of here, do you see any hope that Russian society can kind of be pulled back from the brink here? or is it too far gone, for the next several decades or something, and I'm kind of thinking, is there any hope that something will happen inside Russian society, that things will change? Is there any hope that something from outside Russian society, things will change? Because it certainly looks like this is a very entrenched and stable system at the moment, that whether you like it or not, Putin has really got control of everything, and he faces no dissent, no threat of revolution. And that even if he were to die tomorrow, even if he were to have a heart attack, it's unclear to me that the fundamental nature of what's happening would really change. It seems to me that we would probably get another, a second Putin, and maybe this person would be better or worse at actually pulling the strings. But, if Putin dies, I don't think we're going to, now Russia can be a democracy. There's probably just going to be a scramble for who gets to be the next Putin. Maybe I'm too pessimistic, but what do you see as is there any hope for Russian society to move in a more positive, non-fascist direction?
Although I talk about really miserable things in the book, and this has probably been one of the bleaker conversations that you might have had recently, and probably one of the bleaker listens, so I apologize if you're listening to this on your commute to work, I actually see that there is much more hope for the future than many people would assume. Because what I draw attention to throughout the book, and hopefully throughout this conversation, is how much of this is constructed by the regime, using these modern branding techniques, using digital media, and therefore how much of it can be undone. And if you'd have gone back to, let's say, 1981, and you said the Soviet Union's going to collapse pretty soon, do you think all those Soviets are going to become liberal Democrats? People would have said, no, you're crazy, that's not going to happen. And yet by, 1991, the Soviet Union had collapsed, admittedly due to economic pressures rather than mass protests, although that, around the edges of the Soviet Union, that was certainly the case. The protest movements did help, but I'm just talking in the actual Russian space. And at that point in Russia, Russians were genuinely keen on liberal democracy. Right? So 10 years, everything had changed. People really believed in the values of democracy, of equality, of fairness. They wanted to engage with the West. So what changed? Well, historical experience, for one thing. The American shock therapy certainly didn't help, right? Far more than, you'll hear stories about NATO is responsible for the war. I would say that the Chicago School of Economics is far more responsible for what's happening in Russia today than NATO. What changed, really, was nationalist forces within Russia took power, and nationalist forces influence culture relentlessly to their advantage, and Putin has been very good at this. And so things can change quite quickly. Russians are not, innately predisposed to violence any more than any other people anywhere else in the world. But we can't just leave them to it. Because if we leave Russians to it right now, and especially in some period of turmoil after Putin dies, or if Russia becomes severely weakened, then they will probably just go down the same path again, because the same entrenched powers will take control of the Kremlin. And so I think, on a closing note, it is very much the wrong path to disengage from Russia, or only to engage on an economic basis with Russia rather than thinking about culture, because culture is at the heart of all of this. And therefore, right now, the White House is going in the wrong direction very, very quickly.
Well, believe me, I do have a lot of thoughts about the current White House. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time for that. That would be a much longer discussion. And we are at time, so we'll be wrapping things up now. I want to thank my guest one more time, Ian Garner, and the book, again, is Z Generation, Into the Heart of Russia's Fascist Youth, a book about Russia's control of information, their propaganda strategies, how they communicate to their own people. Highly recommended. I want to thank everyone for listening, and we will catch you at the next episode.